12,500 feet beneath the North Atlantic, robots spent 200 hours photographing a ghost ship. They captured 715,000 images. Every rivet, every deck plate, every scattered shoe in the debris field. And when researchers assembled those images into the first complete three-dimensional model of the Titanic, they discovered something unsettling. The story we have been telling for 112 years was wrong. You know the version. The unsinkable ship. The iceberg in the night. The band playing as she went down. James Cameron showed us exactly how it happened. Documentaries have repeated it for decades. The ship struck ice, flooded, broke in half, and sank. A tragedy. An act of God. Case closed. Except the three-dimensional scans tell a different story. They show hull plates that separated at the seams rather than tearing through the metal. They show evidence of a coal fire that burned in the ship's bunker for 10 days before the collision. They show a bulkhead that failed faster than it should have in exactly the spot where that fire had been raging. And they show a debris field stretching 3 miles across the ocean floor, scattered with the personal effects of 1,500 people who died because of decisions made in boardrooms and shipyards months before the Titanic ever left port. The iceberg did not sink this ship alone. Defective rivets did. Ignored warnings did. Lifeboat regulations that had not been updated in 18 years did. A construction schedule that pressured workers to cut corners did. This is the story of what the technology finally revealed. Not just how the Titanic sank, but why she was doomed before her maiden voyage ever began. And the answers are more disturbing than the iceberg ever was. April 10th, 1912, Southampton, England. The largest ship ever built prepares to depart on her maiden voyage. Titanic carries 2,224 passengers and crew. First-class passengers paid the equivalent of $100,000 in today's money for their tickets. Third-class passengers paid $350. All of them trusted the same hull to get them to New York. What none of them knew was that a fire had been burning inside that hull for nearly 2 weeks. Coal bunker number 6, adjacent to boiler room 6, had ignited sometime during the ship's sea trials in Belfast. Spontaneous combustion in coal bunkers was common enough that White Star Line had procedures for it. Keep shoveling, burn through the smoldering coal to clear the bunker. The fire would exhaust itself eventually. 12 stokers worked in shifts to fight the blaze. They shoveled burning coal into the furnaces and sprayed water on the bulkhead to keep it from warping. The fire would not be fully extinguished until April 13th, one day before the iceberg. The Titanic steamed west across the Atlantic at 22 knots, nearly full speed. On April 14th, her radio operators began receiving ice warnings from other ships. The first came at 9 a.m. from the Coronia, reporting bergs, growlers, and field ice directly ahead. Captain Edward Smith acknowledged the message. At 1:42 p.m., the Baltic reported icebergs and large quantities of field ice. Smith acknowledged this one too and showed it to J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of White Star Line, who was aboard for the maiden voyage. Smith ordered a course correction to take the ship slightly further south, then he maintained speed. 4 more warnings came that afternoon and evening. The America at 1:45 p.m., the Californian at 7:30 p.m., the Mesaba at 9:40 p.m. reporting heavy pack ice and great numbers of large icebergs directly in Titanic's path. This message never reached the bridge. Radio operator Jack Phillips was overwhelmed. The ship's wireless had broken down the day before, creating a backlog of passenger messages he was still clearing. When the Californian called again at 10:30 p.m. to report that she had stopped for the night because of ice, Phillips cut her off. The signal was interfering with his transmissions to Cape Race. 6 warnings, 22 knots. The math was about to catch up with everyone aboard. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted a dark shape against the starlit horizon. He rang the bridge bell 3 times and telephoned down. Iceberg right ahead. First Officer William Murdoch ordered hard starboard and full reverse. The Titanic began to turn. 37 seconds is not enough time to move 46,000 tons of steel out of the way. The collision lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Passengers barely felt it. Some described a slight grinding sensation. Others heard a sound like tearing calico. A few thought something in the engine room had broken. The ship shuddered once and continued forward into the darkness. Most passengers went back to sleep. Below the waterline, the iceberg had opened the Titanic like a can. Not a gash, as legend would later claim, but a series of punctures and separated seams along 300 feet of the starboard hull. The sound passengers heard, that strange tearing noise, was 3 million rivets failing under stress. Water poured into the forward compartments at a rate of 7 tons per second. Thomas Andrews knew what this meant. The ship's designer had been aboard to observe the maiden voyage and note any adjustments needed. Now he walked the damaged sections with a flashlight, watching water rise in the mailroom, cascade down staircases, flood the squash court. He returned to Captain Smith with his assessment. 5 compartments breached. The ship was designed to float with any 4 compartments flooded. Not 5. There was no combination of pumps or counter-flooding that could save her. Andrews estimated they had an hour, perhaps 2. The mathematics of what followed were brutal. Titanic carried 2,224 people. Her lifeboats could hold 1,178. This was not an oversight. It exceeded Board of Trade requirements, which had been written in 1894 for ships 1/4 Titanic's size and never updated. White Star Line thought they were being generous by adding 4 collapsible boats beyond the minimum. The original designer had proposed 48 lifeboats. The idea was rejected because it would clutter the deck. At 12:45 a.m., the first lifeboat was lowered. It was designed to hold 65 people. It carried 28. Officers were uncertain whether the davits could handle a fully loaded boat. They were uncertain who should board first. They were uncertain about everything because no one had ever done this before. Not at this scale, not in these conditions. Boat after boat dropped away from the tilting deck with empty seats. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's stern rose out of the water, hung vertical against the stars for nearly a minute, and then slid beneath the surface. She took approximately 1,500 people with her. Some drowned in the flooding compartments. Some were pulled down by the suction. Most died in the 28-degree water, hypothermia taking them within 15 minutes. 710 survivors floated in the darkness and waited for rescue. The world was shocked. Investigations were held in both America and Britain. Testimony was taken from surviving officers, crew members, and passengers. The official verdict in both countries was essentially the same: an act of God, an unavoidable tragedy. No one was criminally responsible. The industry mourned its dead and moved on. Case closed. Except that 73 years later, when they finally found the wreck, the evidence told a different story entirely. To understand why the Titanic sank, you have to understand how she was built. And to understand how she was built, you have to visit a shipyard in Belfast where 3 million rivets held together the largest moving object ever created by human hands. Harland and Wolff Shipyard employed 15,000 workers at its peak. They had built ships for White Star Line for decades. They knew what they were doing. They also knew they were under pressure. Titanic and her sister ship Olympic were being constructed simultaneously, the 2 largest vessels in history, and White Star needed them operational to compete with Cunard's Lusitania and Mauretania. The schedule was aggressive. The margin for delay was 0. The rivets became the first compromise. A ship like Titanic required 3 million of them. Small iron or steel fasteners, heated until they glowed, were hammered into pre-drilled holes. Their ends mushroomed flat to hold the hull plates together. The technology was proven. The challenge was scale. Harland and Wolff had hydraulic riveting machines that could drive steel rivets with consistent force and precision. But these machines could only reach the flat sections of the hull. The curved bow and stern sections, where the plates bent around the ship's frame, required hand riveting. Teams of 4 men worked with forges and hammers, driving rivets the old way. Steel rivets were stronger. They could withstand more stress before failing. But steel was harder to work by hand. It required higher temperatures and more precise technique. Wrought iron was easier. It heated faster, shaped more readily, and the riveters could work quicker. So Harland and Wolff made a decision. The central 60% of the hull would use steel rivets installed by machine. The bow and stern would use wrought iron rivets installed by hand. This decision would not be examined for another 86 years. When metallurgist Tim Fouke at the National Institute of Standards and Technology finally analyzed rivets recovered from the wreck, he found something disturbing. The wrought iron contained slag, the left behind when iron ore is smelted. Some slag is normal. The Titanic's rivets contained 3 times the acceptable amount. Slag samedo makes iron brittle. Slag concentrations were highest in the rivet heads, exactly where stress would be greatest during an impact. In freezing water under sudden load, these rivets would not bend. They would snap. Foucault's analysis suggested a scenario that matched the survivor testimony perfectly. The iceberg did not tear through the hull plates. It pushed against them. The stress transferred to the rivets. The rivet heads popped off. The hull plates separated at the seams, and water rushed through the gaps. The sound passengers described as tearing calico was the sound of a ship coming apart at its fasteners. The rivets were not the only problem. Hull steel recovered from the wreck showed a chemical composition that would never be approved today. High sulfur content, high oxygen, high phosphorus, low manganese. This combination creates steel with a large grain structure, steel that fractures rather than bends under stress. Modern ship steel is ductile. Hit it hard enough and it deforms, absorbing energy. Titanic steel was brittle. Hit it hard enough and it shattered like ceramic. Charpy impact tests measure how materials behave under sudden stress at different temperatures. Researchers subjected Titanic steel samples to these tests. At freezing temperatures, the steel was 10 times more brittle than modern equivalents. The survivors who heard sounds like breaking china during the collision were not being metaphorical. They were describing the literal behavior of brittle steel fracturing in ice water. Then there was the fire. Coal bunker number 6 sat between boiler room 5 and boiler room 6. Bisected by a watertight bulkhead, the fire that started during sea trials burned on one side of that bulkhead for nearly 2 weeks. Coal fires in enclosed spaces reach temperatures between 500 and 800 degrees Celsius. Steel exposed to these temperatures loses 40% of its strength. The bulkhead separating those boiler rooms was designed to hold back flooding in an emergency. By the time the Titanic left Southampton, that bulkhead had been baking from the inside for 10 days. When the iceberg opened the hull, boiler room 6 was one of the flooded compartments. Water pressure began building against the fire-weakened bulkhead. Naval architects would later calculate that this bulkhead failed faster than the others, accelerating the flooding, tipping the delicate mathematics from survivable to fatal. If 4 compartments flooded, the ship might stay afloat. If 5 compartments flooded, she sinks. The fire may have made the difference. The lifeboat situation was perhaps the most indefensible of all. Titanic could have carried 64 lifeboats. Her davits were designed for it. She sailed with 20. This was not negligence by White Star Line's standards. Board of Trade regulations required ships over 10,000 tons to carry 16 lifeboats. Titanic was 46,000 tons, but the regulation had been written in 1894 and never updated. No one in government had anticipated ships this large. White Star actually exceeded the minimum requirement by adding 4 collapsible boats. They believed they were being safety conscious. Alexander Carlisle, the original managing director of Titanic's design, had proposed a different approach. 48 lifeboats, enough for everyone aboard. His proposal was rejected. Too much deck clutter. It would spoil the promenade views for first-class passengers. Carlisle resigned from the project before construction was complete. The ship that left Southampton on April 10, 1912, carried lifeboat capacity for barely half her passengers. She carried rivets that her builders knew were substandard. She carried steel that would shatter in cold water. She carried a bulkhead weakened by 2 weeks of fire. And she carried a captain who would maintain near maximum speed through an ice field because that was standard practice and no one had told him it should not be. Every one of these decisions was legal. Everyone was defensible by the standards of 1912. Everyone was documented in shipyard records and boardroom minutes. And everyone would remain buried in archives for decades while the official story blamed an iceberg and called it fate. The evidence that could have challenged that story lay 2.5 miles beneath the Atlantic, scattered across a debris field the size of a small town. It would take 73 years and a technology that did not exist in 1912 to finally reach it. And when they did, the wreck had stories to tell that no survivor had ever known. If you are still here, you now understand this disaster was sealed before the ship ever left port. Comment the number 2 below if you are following this investigation. If you have not subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you do not miss what comes next. Your support helps us tell the stories that official histories tried to close. Now let us see what 73 years of darkness finally revealed. For 73 years, the Titanic kept her secrets. Explorers knew approximately where she had gone down. Survivors had recorded the coordinates, but 2.5 miles of black water separated the surface from the seafloor, and no technology existed to bridge that gap. The wreck sat in darkness and silence while the world above debated what had really happened. Robert Ballard changed that in 1985. Ballard was an oceanographer with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He had been obsessed with finding the Titanic since childhood. In the summer of 1985, he led a joint American and French expedition to the North Atlantic. Equipped with Argo, a deep-towed camera sled that could transmit live video from the ocean floor. The French team had spent weeks scanning the search area with sonar. They found nothing. Ballard took over in late August with a different strategy. Instead of looking for the hull, he would look for the debris field. A sinking ship leaves a trail of wreckage. Find the trail and follow it to the source. At 1:05 in the morning on September 1st, 1985, a member of Ballard's team spotted something on the monitor, a round shape in the mud, then another. Boilers. Titanic's massive boilers. Scattered across the seafloor like discarded toys. The team followed the debris trail north, and within hours they were looking at something no one had seen in 73 years. The bow of the Titanic, rising from the sediment, her anchor chain still in place, her name still visible on the hull. The discovery made headlines around the world, but Argo's cameras revealed something unexpected. The Titanic had not sunk in one piece. Her stern lay nearly 2,000 feet from the bow, twisted and mangled almost beyond recognition. The ship had broken apart on the surface, just as some survivors had claimed and official inquiries had dismissed. The wreck was already challenging the accepted narrative. But Argo could only show fragments. Murky water limited visibility. The cameras captured pieces of the ship, never the whole picture. Understanding the Titanic from these images was like trying to comprehend an elephant by touching its trunk in total darkness. Researchers could see damage, they could not see context. Expeditions continued through the 1990s and the 2000s. James Cameron dove to the wreck in 1995 while researching his film. RMS Titanic Incorporated, the company with salvage rights, conducted multiple expeditions and recovered 5,500 artifacts. Each visit brought better cameras and more footage, but the fundamental limitation remained. The wreck was too large, the visibility too poor, and the technology too primitive to capture the complete picture. Every documentary, every book, every expert analysis was based on partial information. In 2010, RMS Titanic Incorporated conducted what would be their last major expedition for 14 years. They documented the wreck's condition and noted accelerating deterioration. Bacteria were consuming the iron at a rate of 400 pounds per day. The ship was slowly disappearing. Then the expedition stopped. For over a decade, the Titanic sat alone in the darkness while technology advanced exponentially on the surface above. In 2022, a company called Magellan decided to do something unprecedented. Magellan was a deep-sea mapping firm that had developed revolutionary scanning technology. They partnered with Atlantic Productions, a documentary company, to attempt the largest underwater three-dimensional scanning project in history. The goal was audacious. They would not just photograph the Titanic. They would create a complete digital twin, accurate to the millimeter, capturing the entire wreck and the surrounding debris field as if the ocean had been drained away. They deployed two remotely operated vehicles named Romeo and Juliet. For 6 weeks in the summer of 2022, these robots descended 12,500 feet to the sea floor and methodically photographed every visible surface of the wreck. They worked around the clock in freezing darkness, navigating underwater currents and avoiding contact with the fragile structure. They photographed the bow section and the stern section. They photographed the debris field stretching 3 miles between them. They captured 715,000 images and recorded 16 terabytes of data. By the time they finished, they had gathered 10 times more information than any previous underwater three-dimensional model had ever attempted. Researchers spent 7 months assembling the images into a coherent whole. The result was stunning. For the first time in 110 years, you could see the Titanic as she actually existed. Not fragments in murky water, not artist renderings based on speculation. The actual ship, every rivet visible, every deck plate mapped, every piece of debris cataloged in precise relationship to everything else. The digital twin revealed details that decades of expeditions had missed. One of the lifeboats had not been deployed because a jammed metal piece blocked its release mechanism. An open steam valve in the engine room proved that crew members had stayed at their posts keeping the electricity running, allowing distress signals to transmit long after the collision. This was not speculation. This was forensic evidence, captured in 3 dimensions and available for analysis forever. The debris field told its own stories. Personal effects were scattered across the sea floor. Shoes still paired where bodies had come to rest and decomposed. Champagne bottles still corked. A bronze statue called Diana of Versailles, 2 feet tall, the centerpiece of the first-class lounge, had been thrown to the ocean floor when the ship broke apart. Researchers had photographed her once in 1986, but lost track of her location. The 3-dimensional scan found her again. In 2024, RMS Titanic Incorporated returned for their first expedition in 14 years. They brought technology that made equipment from 2010 look primitive. Their remotely operated vehicles captured 2 million photographs with resolution that would have been impossible a decade earlier. They came looking for artifacts to target for future recovery. They found something else. The bow railing was gone. The iconic spot where Leonardo DiCaprio had stood in Cameron's film, where tourists had imagined themselves king of the world, had collapsed. It had been intact as recently as 2022, sometime in the intervening 2 years. Corrosion finally won. 15 feet of railing now lay on the seafloor below the bow. The company released the images with a somber statement. Titanic will literally never look the same, but the 2024 expedition also confirmed what the 3-dimensional scans had suggested. The hull damage pattern showed plates separated at seams, consistent with rivet failure rather than tearing. The break between bow and stern showed evidence of violent separation, not the relatively clean split depicted in films. The stern's catastrophic condition proved the breakup had involved forces far more destructive than anyone had imagined. Fire-affected areas showed accelerated corrosion in exactly the locations predicted by the coal bunker theory. The technology had finally caught up with the questions. For 112 years, researchers debated what really sank the Titanic based on survivor testimony, shipyard records, and incomplete glimpses of the wreck. Now they had a complete forensic model. They could measure distances, calculate stresses, and trace the sequence of failures, from first impact to final plunge. When they assembled all that evidence, the story it told was not about an iceberg at all. It was about 3 million rivets, a coal fire, brittle steel, and a series of decisions made by men who would never face consequences for them. The wreck had been waiting 73 years to testify. The technology had finally arrived to hear what it had to say. The 3-dimensional scans did not just show researchers what the Titanic looked like, they showed what had actually happened. The rivet failure theory came first. Tim Folke's metallurgical analysis suggested that substandard rivets popped under impact stress, allowing hull plates to separate at the seams. The 3-dimensional model settled the debate. Hull plates along the damaged section had clearly separated at their edges, pulling away from each other rather than tearing through the metal. The pattern was consistent across 300 feet of damage. Rivets had failed. Seams had opened. Water had poured through the gaps exactly as Folke had predicted. The bow section, where the iceberg struck, was riveted by hand with wrought iron. The central hull, riveted by machine with steel, showed no comparable failures. If Harland and Wolff had used steel rivets throughout, the bow might have held. Naval architects used the digital twin to reconstruct the collision. The impact lasted 6.3 seconds. At 22 knots, the force transferred to those hull seams was enormous. At a lower speed, the impact forces would have been reduced, and the rivets might have held. Every knot of speed that Captain Smith maintained translated directly into stress on fasteners that were already compromised. The bulkhead failure told another part of the story. The 3-dimensional scans showed that the bulkhead between boiler rooms 5 and 6 had failed faster than adjacent bulkheads. This was the bulkhead exposed to the coal fire for nearly 2 weeks. Fire weakened steel, subjected to increasing water pressure, gave way sooner than it should have. 4 compartments flooded, the ship might survive. 5 compartments flooded, she sinks. The breakup required complete revision. Cameron's film depicted the Titanic breaking relatively cleanly. The 3-dimensional evidence proved it wrong. The bow on the seafloor was eerily intact. The stern was a compressed mass of wreckage, barely identifiable. The ship had not split cleanly. She had been torn apart. Brittle steel in freezing water did not bend. It shattered. No single failure sank the Titanic. It was a cascade. Substandard rivets that should have been steel. Fire-weakened bulkheads that should have been intact. Speed that should have been reduced. Lifeboats that should have been provided. Ice warnings that should have been heeded. Each factor alone might not have been fatal. Together, they guaranteed disaster. The iceberg was merely the trigger. The gun had been loaded in shipyards and boardrooms months before. The 3-dimensional scans could not show who made each decision or why, but they could show, with forensic precision, exactly how those decisions translated into 1,500 deaths in the North Atlantic. The Titanic changed everything. just not in time to save the people aboard her. Within months of the disaster, the International Ice Patrol was established to monitor North Atlantic shipping lanes. It still operates today. The first international convention for the safety of life at sea mandated lifeboats for every passenger, not just the minimum that outdated regulations required. Ships were required to maintain 24-hour radio watch, so warnings would never again pile up unread while operators cleared passenger messages. Construction standards were overhauled. Design philosophies were reconsidered. The lessons were learned. They cost 1,500 lives to teach. The wreck remains 12,500 feet beneath the Atlantic, and it is still testifying. Each expedition reveals new details. Each technological advance allows researchers to examine evidence that previous generations could not access. The three-dimensional digital twin will allow analysis to continue indefinitely, even as the physical ship crumbles into the sea floor. Bacteria consume 400 pounds of iron every day. The bow railing has already collapsed. More will follow. Within decades, the wreck may be unrecognizable, but the digital model preserves what the ocean is slowly erasing. The site is more than evidence, it is a grave. Approximately 1,500 people went down with the ship, and most of them remain there. UNESCO designated the wreck a protected heritage site in 2012. Every expedition holds a memorial service before the work begins. The debris field, stretching 3 miles across the seafloor, contains the personal effects of the dead. Shoes are still paired where bodies came to rest and decomposed over a century ago. The researchers who mapped every millimeter of that field understood they were documenting something sacred. We have called this disaster many things over 112 years. A tragedy, an act of God, the end of an era, the unsinkable ship that sank. Each phrase distances us from the uncomfortable truth that the three-dimensional scans have made undeniable. This was not fate. This was not inevitable. This was the result of choices made by people who prioritize schedule over safety, cost over quality, regulation over reason. The rivets were a choice, the speed was a choice, the lifeboats were a choice, the fire that weakened the bulkhead was known and accepted. The ice warnings that went unheeded arrived on a radio that officers understood. Every contributing factor was preventable. Every death was unnecessary. The iceberg has carried the blame for 112 years. It makes a convenient villain, an act of nature, an unavoidable hazard of North Atlantic travel. But the iceberg did not install substandard rivets in the bow. The iceberg did not let a coal fire burn for 2 weeks against a watertight bulkhead. The iceberg did not reject Alexander Carlisle's proposal for 48 lifeboats because they would clutter the deck. The debris field holds the evidence: bronze statues and champagne bottles and shoes that once belonged to people who trusted the wrong ship. The three-dimensional scans captured it all in forensic detail that will outlast the wreck itself. A permanent record of what happens when institutions fail and no one is held accountable. The iceberg pulled the trigger, but the shipyard loaded the gun.